typically for practices with revenue of 2 million or more, ideally EBITDA of 500,000 or more. That's where you see the higher multiples. That's where you see the 6, the 7, the 8, the 9x multiples. Oftentimes what we see is a DSO will dangle the carrot of a sexy EBITDA multiple. They're going to try to convince you your EBITDA is lower than it is so that they can buy low. The devil is in the details.
This is Dental All-Stars, where we bring you the best in dentistry on marketing, management, and training.
Welcome to Dental All-Stars. I'm Alex Nottingham, founder and CEO of All-Star Dental Academy, and with me is Brannon Moncrief, the CEO of McLerran Associates, a practice transitions company, and we're talking about DSO Acquisitions. Welcome, Brannon.
Thank you. Good to see you, Alex.
Yeah. So this is part two of our first part. We talked about practice valuations. We went into detail about that, specifically for private valuations and how private practitioners are selling their practices and private practices are buying their practices. And then we had time where we were talking about, okay, now let's talk about DSOs. And that's a whole nother space or discussion. So I wanted to dedicate this podcast to DSOs, all things DSOs, DSO acquisitions. So tell me, why is it, I guess we'll go right to it. Do I want to go right to it? Yeah, we'll go right to it. Because I really like when we spoke about it. This was fun about a podcast. Like, what do I feel like? So on the last podcast, okay, and it's a really good one, you talk about valuations. And it might come up again in our discussion. We're not going to rehash it because I want you to go back because it was really good on how do we value a practice. And you gave multiple methods, which I think were really helpful. So let's not rehash this. So I want to go right into it, Brannon. Why are so many large practices or practice owners choosing to affiliate with DSOs? Let's start with that.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to give a little context as to where we sit in the marketplace, we provide sell-side advisory to large practice owners that are looking to monetize their business, whether they're looking to sell to a private buyer, as we discussed last time, or looking to go down the DSO private equity route. Our clients come to us with a myriad of reasons as to why they're interested in affiliating with the DSO. There's a few that are top of the list, though. So DSOs typically assign a higher valuation to a practice than private buyers do. DSOs look at valuation through the lens of a multiple of EBITDA. So for instance, let's take a $2 million top line revenue practice with EBITDA of 500,000.
Okay.
In the private buyer world, that practice might trade on a good day for somewhere in the range of 1.6 to 1.8 million. In the DSO world, it's going to trade for a multiple of EBITDA, and that multiple of EBITDA could be somewhere in the range of 6 to 7 times EBITDA. So you could be looking at anywhere from 3 million to 3.5 million valuation in the DSO world compared to about half that typically for practices with revenue of 2 million or more, ideally EBITDA of 500,000 or more. That's where you see the higher multiples. That's where you see the 6, the 7, the 8, the 9x multiples.
That makes sense. And I will say, you use the word bifurcation. I think that's the word of the day for everyone. We'll look that up. That's a very good word. Well done with that. So tell me about let's see, I guess I want to go back to valuation. So how do DSOs evaluate the practice? So like you said, in that they're looking for those, and that you said earlier, there's a split between private buyers that over 2 million or whatever, multiple providers, bifurcated, yes, and key man risk, which makes a lot of sense that they don't want to rely on one person, the doctor. If something fails, then or everybody wants that doctor, that can be a problem. That's why often very specialized dentistry, cosmetic dentistry, can be a problem because it's very personality driven. They're looking for the bread and butter. It's a business. So tell me about the valuations of DSOs and maybe how it compares to private practice.
Yeah, so DSOs look at valuation through the lens of a multiple of EBITDA. So EBITDA stands for earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. But think of EBITDA as absentee owner profit. So pretend that you didn't work chairside in your practice and you had to pay another doctor to do all the dentistry. After you pay the overhead and pay doctors to do the dentistry, how much profit is left over for the absentee owner? Because as a corporate entity that owns a practice, you are, technically an absentee owner. You're not drawing a wage. So a lot of what we do is make sure that we're controlling the narrative regarding EBITDA. So we take revenue minus true overhead expenses after accounting for any non-cash expenses like depreciation and amortization, after accounting for any personal or discretionary expenses that you're writing off through your business, like your car, meals, travel, things of that nature. Looking at any non-recurring one-time expenses, such as, let's say you bought a cone beam or you renovated your office, we would add back those overhead expenses because they're non-recurring. And then looking at any overhead expenses that would be eliminated via leveraging the DSO's infrastructure, like accounting or legal, compliance, consulting, whatever that might be. You got to first start with an accurate EBITDA calculation and then apply an appropriate multiple.
Oh, so they remove those in their calculation because they're going to absorb them.
Well, we
You do. Oh, so again, your representative dentist says, hey, I know what you're doing. We're not going to count that because you already have a legal and accounting department that's, spread and it's, economies of scale here. Okay. So you're able to work the DSO a little bit with respect to that.
Absolutely. So EBITDA should be objective, but the reality is it's very subjective. And a lot of the value that we provide to our clients is controlling that narrative regarding EBITDA, because every dollar of EBITDA is worth $6 to $9 in practice value. Because as I said, you calculate the EBITDA first, and then you apply an appropriate multiple to that EBITDA to ultimately arrive at the valuation. The number one way that DSOs are opportunistic is they want to do a deal in the dark. They don't want somebody like me at the table. They don't want you to have a sell-side advisor. They don't want your CPA involved. They don't really want your attorney involved. They want to get to you before we get to you.
Sure.
Because they want to control the narrative regarding EBITDA. They want to buy low and sell high. That's the name of the game. So oftentimes what happens is we're contacted by a doctor that's got a letter of intent from a DSO. How did they get a hold of that DSO? Typically what happens is their colleague down the street sold to that DSO and then introduced them to the DSO they partnered with. They fail to disclose that they're going to get a handsome referral fee if you partner with that DSO and your deal ultimately closes, but they rave about the experience they've had with this DSO. You need to talk to them, and they introduce you to the business development person, and you start what you think is a rather casual conversation. It quickly ends up with an offer in hand. Well, we always tell docs, hey, press pause on that conversation. Allow us to do an objective EBITDA analysis and gut check the EBITDA calculation that the DSO has come up with, because that's what their offer is predicated on. Oftentimes what we see is a DSO will dangle the carrot of a sexy EBITDA multiple. So they'll say, hey doc, your EBITDA is 400,000. We're going to give you a 7 times EBITDA multiple. We're going to give you a $2.8 million valuation on your business. And 7X, I mean, that's as good as you're going to get in the marketplace. So no reason to call Brannon and his team, no reason to shop the deal. And we say, hold on, press pause. Let us do an EBITDA analysis. And we find out that EBITDA is actually 600,000, not 400,000. And at a $2.8 million valuation, they're not even at a 5X EBITDA multiple. So they're opportunistic. They're going to try to convince you your EBITDA is lower than it is so that they can buy low. And our job is to hold their feet to the fire, control that narrative regarding EBITDA, and then create a competitive environment, essentially create a bidding war for your practice to give you as much optionality and perspective as possible, right? You need to date around. You need to understand all the options available in the marketplace to make sure you find the right fit and then leverage that competition to maximize the economic outcome. So control the narrative regarding EBITDA is huge benefit that we bring to our clients. I feel like half of our day is spent arguing with DSO buyers about EBITDA on behalf of our clients.
Not to mention the devil's in the details too. In terms of how things vest and what they want from you and so on. So you got to get representation. I hear they don't want an attorney, and that scares me because it may not be a proper deal because you have a heavyweight versus a lightweight. Dentists don't typically know. So always get representation. And obviously you guys are great at that. That's what we're talking about it. Okay. So what would you, because that we kind of round out this podcast, well, we got so much in a short period of time. I love it. So how would you, these are my last two questions I have for you, and you got this down. So what have you seen as major changes over the past few years at DSOs? I know you mentioned 1.0 versus 2.0, but you can expand about that. And lastly, what would you say the key differences are in selling to a DSO versus private?
Great questions. So as far as changes that we've seen in the DSO landscape over the past few years, I'll just kind of give you a quick history lesson on the evolution of the consolidation. We talked a little about the evolution from DSO 1.0 to DSO 2.0. Today, I think going the DSO route is a much more legitimate option than it was 7, 10, 15 years ago. So that's been one marked change. But dentistry was arguably one of the highest verticals that private equity was investing in pre-COVID. Dentistry is recession-proof, and it's a highly fragmented marketplace that can benefit from organization, leveraging economies of scale to increase reimbursement rates from payers and decrease pricing from vendors. It's kind of a perfect fit for the type of industries that private equity invest in. So private equity loved dentistry going into COVID. Dentistry rebounded as fast or faster than any other healthcare vertical. Practices following COVID. Practices were closed for 30 to 90 days, but depending on what state your practice was located in. But when practices reopened, they rebounded super quick. And I think that's a product of the fact that dentistry is way ahead of the curve when it comes to sterilization and airborne illness. And most dentists have a great level of trust with their patients. So patients came back very quickly post-COVID. So there were a lot of DSOs that were already buying practices leading up to COVID. They doubled down and started buying practices at an even faster clip in 21 and 22. There were a lot of private equity firms that were eyeing an investment in dentistry that pulled the trigger immediately post-COVID, bought a platform and started building a DSO. So the number of DSOs doubled overnight post-COVID. And as a result of a huge increase in demand and relatively consistent supply as far as practice owners looking to monetize their business goes, valuations increased by about 40 to 50% from 2019 to 2022. So it was a great time to be a seller in 21 and 22. I think that's about as frothy as the market has ever been and ever will be. But come 2023, interest rates doubled almost overnight. And private equity firms use a lot of leverage to fuel the growth of these businesses. So interest rates play havoc with their cash flow and their success rate. Combine that with the fact that many of the DSOs were rather undisciplined in 21 and 22. They were buying every practice they could get their hands on, doing very little diligence. They were not really integrating and operating the businesses that they were acquiring. You combine that with the elevated interest rate environment, and some DSOs found themselves in trouble over the past 24 months. They were either on their heels, operationally or financially. Maybe they weren't buying practices anymore. There were other DSOs that were built on a very strong foundation that were not behaving irresponsibly in 21 and 22, and they've kind of stayed steady Eddie over the past 24 months. And then there's smaller emerging DSOs that took on private equity capital more recently. They kind of stepped in to fill the void that some of those legacy DSOs that were on the sidelines left in the marketplace. But all in, what's happened is over the past 24 months, recaps were either delayed or muted. A lot of DSOs were focused on kind of getting their shop in order after a crazy level of M&A activity in 21 and 22. And now we've seen that valuations have cooled slightly comparative to where they were in 21 and 22. I would say as a whole, valuations have come down about 1 turn of EBITDA across the board. Still operating in an elevated valuation environment comparative to pre-COVID, still a great time to be a seller of a large practice that's looking to go the DSO route, but the market's just not as frothy as it was in 21 and 22. Thankfully, we've now entered a little bit more favorable macroeconomic climate. We're in a declining interest rate environment. The capital markets are starting to open back up. We've seen multiple recapitalization events in the first quarter of 2025 at good returns on invested capital. And I think you're going to see that continue over the next 6 to 18 months. So it's been interesting to kind of watch the evolution of the M&A activity in the DSO side of our space. And I mean, that's the sandbox we play in every day. So we've been, right in the middle of that storm. But the reality is we're still getting amazing results for our clients that want to go, down that path if they want to go to market today.
I don't know why when you said it's interesting, interest, I don't know, it just popped up at me. It's all about interest. So kind of, towards the conclusion, kind of wrapping up this podcast as well as part one, how would you kind of summarize the key differences between selling to a DSO versus a private buyer?
So they're very different, right? When we're looking at valuation, we always try to educate our clients. Hey, here's what your business is worth if you sold to another clinician in the private buyer world. Here's what your business is worth if you sell to a DSO. And here are the key differences. So one, obviously, we've talked about the difference in valuation, especially as a practice gets larger. There's a pretty big delta between a private buyer valuation and a DSO valuation. However, a private buyer deal is relatively simplistic. It's typically 100% or close to 100% cash at closing. So the deal structure is very straightforward. DSO transactions have a lot more structure and a lot more nuance. You're going to look at getting somewhere in the range of 50 to 70% of the valuation in cash at close. And then the remainder is going to be some form of equity, whether that's retained equity in your own business, what we call joint venture equity, or stock in the DSO's holding company, what we call holdco equity, or a combination of the two. And there may be some type of earnout or seller note or preferred equity component, but the deals have a lot more nuance. So like you said earlier, the devil is in the details. And in a private buyer deal, typically you're going to be looking at limited post-closing involvement. You might stay on for a month, you might stay on for 6 months, maybe max a year. Whereas in the DSO world, they're looking for a long-term commitment, likely a 3 to 5 year post-closing commitment. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to continue working chairside full-time for 5 years. It just means that they want you to have a vested interest in the performance of that business for an ongoing basis. So those are the three primary differences, the gap in valuation between each of those worlds, the difference in the structure with the DSO deals being much more structured, much more nuanced, and the post-closing commitment is substantial in the DSO world compared to a private buyer sale.
So typically, if I want out and I don't want any details, whatever, I might be better out on the private front. And if I'm 2 million or under, then I might get a similar valuation. Still would be good to work with guys like you, companies like yourself. But as the multiples get higher, as the size gets higher, as the potential opportunity cost gets higher, then DSOs, are a better front, but it's a business decision and there'll be some strings attached because they are hedging. Another word we didn't put in here. They're hedging their risk, right, with respect to what they're doing. They're not going to go all in. They don't want, they want some insurance with respect to that. So that makes a lot of sense. I really appreciate, Brannon, the education, just in if you combine these two podcasts, it's about an hour, but it's such a great education. So for those that are listening, if they want to learn more about you and your company, just tell me a little bit about your company. Who do you serve? How does one get in touch with you? Tell me. And where do we go?
So we serve dentists and dental specialists all across the country. Our headquarters is, that's where I live, based in Austin, Texas. We have an office in Atlanta as well as an office in LA. So whatever specialty you're into, whatever size practice you have, our team can absolutely help you. Whether you want to go the private buyer route, whether you want to go the DSO route, or you're simply interested about, what is my business worth and what are the strengths and weaknesses and what do I need to work on to reverse engineer the goal that you ultimately want to achieve. With every doctor, we start with a 30-minute casual confidential discovery call with me, just to get to know each other and see if it makes sense to do a deep dive, see if it makes sense to quantify your options, quantify what your business is worth. And docs can reach directly out to me. Normally I say, hey, shoot me a text and we can schedule a time to talk. My cell phone number is 512-660-8505, or you can shoot me an email at Brannon, Brannon, at dentaltransitions.com. Visit our website, dentaltransitions.com. It's got a lot of resources and articles, webinars and podcasts just like this. We look at this as an opportunity to educate first, right? And get to know you so that you can understand your options, what your business is worth, and what is the next best step for your practice. And then take the conversation from there. You'll never feel any pressure from us to go one route or the other, or sell today or sell 5 years from now. Doesn't matter to me. We're blessed to be busy, and I just want to do what's in the best interest of your clients and your listeners.
Well, Brannon, I appreciate the education. I appreciate the kindness. Thank you so much for joining us. And remember to follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Get the episodes as they are released. Share with your friends. And until next time, go out there and be an all-star.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Dental All Stars. Visit us online at allstardentalacademy.com.